You say we do a little polishing up. No, not the paint, the turd. Yeah, I said turd. The turd that is the Dana 30 axle. So some of the things that are going into my polish recipe here, Barnes 4-wheel drive, heavy-duty mounts and brackets. Doing my own copy of the Iron Rock Off-Road Almost Alloy U-joint cap supports. We're going to be doing a mile marker kit that's no longer made. So it's something you have to pick up used, or you can get a new one from, I think Spintech makes one, Yukon. There's a couple of them out there. It's a great time to go through and replace your unit bearings if you're going to be running those. All the axle seals are getting replaced. Heavy duty diff cover from Dr. Z Fabrication, who's local to me. Doing axle sleeves from Barnes as well. And Ironman inner C-gussets. WJ knuckles and brakes, 410 gears, torque locker, and BFG 33-inch equivalent tires on 17-inch wheels. So let's jump into it. If you could subscribe, if you're not already a subscriber, that would be great. Keep up with all the great content that we've got going on. And Patreon is there for you that want to support us in everything that we do here at BleepinJeep. And let's dive into the polish. I got all the brackets cleaned off. I just basically need to do some more wire wheel around some of the surfaces here, but for the most part, this is ready to go. I'm planning on running 10 factory axle end seals. And to do that, you need to be able to protrude that inside the axle tube a little bit. So I'm gonna push that back probably about a ½ an inch. And that still leaves enough room on the other side for the inner axle seal. Drilling the holes for the plug welds. And the minimum number of holes they want for the long side is 8. And minimum for the short side is 6. Center on the opposite side of that, we'll do 4. Front, top, and bottom, back. You want to just use a drift punch to center your holes to start, and then start a pilot hole. So I ended up drilling 6 holes. Next up, we're going to be turning these parts into this. This is your coil bucket and shock mount. And there's a few parts here that we obviously need to weld together. First step is going to be to press this down so that the coil kind of has a slanted track to sit in. So that needs to be pushed down to where it is, top of that piece is flush with the bottom of this. We got the shock mount tabs, which go in there like that. 2 of those spaced out with bushing like that. Then there's 2 pieces to this. So obviously that piece, the rounded edge of that, needs to go along the rounded edge of this. These edges go flat to that, and then this sits on top of there. Weld this around the inside first because we don't want a bead sitting around the outside. If you look at this one, there's no room for a bead. They come with this hole here pre-drilled, and that should be the center of your spring. So just took a proper size nut there, weld it on, and then you've got the ability to thread on some bump stops. Ready to weld on the coil buckets, and what we first need to do is make sure that the service cover housing here is at 90 degrees or 0 degrees, depending on how your magnetic angle finder is on there. So I've got that at 90, and then this needs to be angled 10 degrees back. Also, you need to measure the width between coil buckets. That is gonna probably vary a little bit, so I know what they are on my existing axle, and that's what I'm matching them to on this. With these Barnes brackets, they've added all the material thickness on the inside. So these measure the same width on the outside. So if you measure inside to inside, outside to outside on your Jeep's brackets, it's gonna be the same on these. Just don't measure to the inside because that'll be different given the added thickness. First thing that I want to do here is going to be to mark this at 3/4 of an inch in from the inside. So that mounts to the axle this way. So inside is going to be this edge here. And I'm going to hold that tight to the edge of the steel there, not measuring off of the cam plate, measuring off the bracket. And line 3/4 of an inch. Make a nice mark there. So Sharpie mark is here. And that's where that's going to align right there. Holding it tight to this inside edge and cupped to the axle tube is really about where it sits at 2 degrees, but always want to double check that to be sure. So I'm just going to tack this here with that tight, then I'll check with the angle finder. Oh, it's right in between now. It's pretty much dead on at 1 degree still. Yeah, that's 2 degrees. Why put all this work into a Dana 30? Wouldn't it be the same amount of effort and money to build up a Dana 44? Well, one of the key things that I wanted to stay away from, given that I'm running the TDI engine and the oil pan does not have the deep sump and the shallow front part to it like a 4.0 does, I wanted to stay away from adding a truss to my axle. But I wanted to beef it up as much as possible without having to have the added bulk of a truss. I know there are some trusses that, you know, they come down along the diff and they kind of hug the top of the axle, but that still adds a couple inches to above the axle tube, and I don't have a lot of room between the top of the axle and the oil pan, and I don't want to jack this thing up 8 inches. So I'm riding about 5 inches of lift, and I've only got maybe 8 inches or 10 inches at the most from the axle tube to the oil pan. I've got it bump stopped now, so I could hit a bump as hard as possible and it's not going to hit my oil pan, but if I had a truss on there, I'd have to bump stop it even more, which would then limit my up travel when flexing. So key thing was beef it up as much as possible, no truss. There's a couple key considerations that I took when deciding to stay with the Dana 30. Mainly weight. Weight is a huge factor. It's not going to be an enormous difference between a 44 and a 30, but it is still a significant weight difference. Ground clearance being another one. Again, not a huge difference, but the Dana 30 is pretty small. Yeah, there's a pretty good ground clearance for 33s with a smaller diff of the Dana 30. Also, width. The width is perfect. Also, lug pattern. Dana 44s from a Wagoneer are going to have a 6-lug pattern on them, and then changing those axle shafts or stub shafts out to be a 5-lug 4.5 or 5-on-5 maybe, and then changing the rear. That's a big added cost. and just another step in the process of converting that axle to work in the Jeep. Also, just the fact that it's Jeep parts. You know, you can go to Advance Auto, O'Reilly's, whoever, Napa, get a pinion seal for a Dana 30. It's gonna work. You can get, you know, carrier bearing for a Dana 30. It's gonna be, you know, quick, easy. You don't have to think, you know, what axle did that come out of. It's, you know, gonna be Jeep Cherokee parts. Also, the brakes. The WJ brakes that I'm running on here are a massive improvement over the single piston, smaller diameter rotor that were on the Dana 30 from the factory. So those are kind of the key things that kept me with the Dana 30. Again, it's kind of, you know, it's up to the user and what your goals are for the build. This is the bottom, and I've labeled this one as passenger side, driver's side. Main difference being this little notch here. So that side has a notch, that's for your sway bar bracket. So passenger side, gonna sit in there. What I've done to get this to sit the way I want it is grind this. So you're gonna get these, they're gonna all be square edged and, you know, just press formed pieces, and these need to be ground to sit the way you want on your C. Tack this in place before you weld any long beads on there, of course. And again, notch is facing forward. If you are just adding these to an existing axle, that will be dead obvious. If, like me, your axle is completely stripped, it'll be easy to forget. Now for the upper C-gussets, you need to do a similar thing to the bottom, and these are also directional. So there's a notch in here for your coil, and it's also cut differently there, so you can see how left and right differ there. The coil part is going to face forward, and we need to do the same kind of thing with the grinding. So like 45s, or just kind of taking the edge off as a start on most every surface here. This one's how they come. You can kind of see how this one doesn't fit. And then this one being clearanced, sits on there a lot easier. I haven't bent anything. We got a pretty big gap all in here. And what Andy from Ironman says to do is set your heat settings on your welder fairly low, and your wire speed kind of lower in that range as well. And you want to fill in this whole area with 2 passes. And what he suggests you do is to work from the top down with the tip of the gun pointed up. And you're kind of filling this all in, weave it back and forth, do both sides, and then let it cool, come back through and redo it. Here's what the top looks like after one pass. I'll do another pass to fill that in more. This is a kit that was made by Mile Marker a little while back. They don't currently make this, though you can get parts for them through Mile Marker. Warren also made essentially the same kit. Mile Marker's 428 hub is the Ford Explorer hub that this uses. And I believe the spindle is custom. This, as well as the bearing, kind of the main hub bearing that this uses. The wheel studs press through the rotor into this bearing assembly. And this is a Explorer Sport Trac rotor, which is the correct lug spacing and offset to do WJ brakes, but it is not the correct hub bore. So I had to have this machined out to the correct tolerance. So the first step would be, of course, to install the axle shaft. I'm not gonna do that here. Running WJ brakes, you need these 1/4 inch spacers. All right, so that's the spindle. Obviously you would have your stub shaft. And then next step would be with your bearings and seal all pressed into this assembly. That's gonna go on. And then bearings, axle nut, that goes on, gets tightened down to specs. Then this guy goes on there and that pin has to align. And then it gets a second jam nut on that flange. Okay, then at that point you would have snap ring and washer that go on your stub shaft. And then you get your locking hub. This gets an O-ring, and then your locking hub gets installed before the wheel. If you see between the caliper and the knuckle there, I had to add a washer. I'm guessing this is somewhat of a variable depending on the style of hub that you're using. For these being the manual hubs, really not sure what Jeep Cherokee hub year those would equate to, but you want the caliper to be centered on your rotor, and I had to add that spacer there to get this to where it wasn't contacting the rotor on the inside here. So now it's nice and centered, everything spins freely. So the way that's fitting, I need to grind this. From this being formed the way it was, this has kind of a little bit of a bevel to it. So I need to grind this corner so it's smooth, and that'll sit nice and tight in there, and that'll be good. Setting up the upper control arm bracket that I'm doing here. First step is to center. And it doesn't quite look center because of the way that the thing's a little bit cockeyed there. But centering that piece of DOM for the bushing. And it needs to be a 1/4 inch on the heavier side of those. So it's kind of got a light side and a heavy side. If you can see that, for the way that that passes through there. So I'm just using a holding magnet to keep that exactly where I have it there, and then I'm going to tack that and weld it around the outside. Set it on the axle tube where it belongs. Where the diff cover bolts on is right at 90 degrees. So that means that my bracket here, I want to be angled 5 degrees back. So I'm going to move the gauge over to that, of course. And we'll get our 5 degrees. This is like 10 gauge steel, and I'm going to weld this to the ears of the axle shafts. So it just keeps the axle ear from stretching, keeps the U-joint cap from popping out, and this is just lightly welded on there, just enough to keep this from flying off. And there's just enough clearance using this piece of metal that it's not going to contact the inside of the knuckle at all. This is bent a little bit. As you can see, just bent in a little vise brake that I have, or you could easily do this as well, just in a regular bench vise and using a hammer or pliers, pipe wrench, something like that to bend it. You can also just do this as simply with a washer. This is just going to get welded along here and here. And the only downside to doing this is then you need to take a grinder to this to replace a U-joint. I've tack welded these all on in 4 places, and now I'm going to test fitment inside the knuckle just to make sure that none of these contact anything. Kind of see at this stage how tight of a fit that is through the knuckle opening there. Not all the way in, of course. So you can see here I'm contacting on the edges of this plate here that's facing the camera. It clears all the other bolts except for this top one. So I'll want to grind that down a little bit, maybe tap on it with the hammer. That same plate is hitting the front bolt now with it turned. Steer it while continuing to turn and check for any binding or contact. The biggest rebuttal I see to running these things is, you're gonna cook your U-joints. I just finished welding this. I went through each of them pretty quickly. I did one side on each and then flipped it and did the other side. And I don't want to touch the ear, but I can touch the U-joint, and it's maybe 100 degrees. It's not enough to cook out any grease. Not enough to melt these rubber seals. The last piece of the puzzle of this front axle is going to be installing this torque locker in the Dana 30. So this is an automatic locker. You've heard of Aussie locker, you might have heard of torque locker. It is a lunchbox locker that it's not a full carrier replacement. Essentially, it's just these cam plates and then your axle side. So this kind of all goes together exactly. Not a difficult little puzzle to solve here. Made in the USA, which is awesome. So it's really those 4 main pieces is kind of what there is to it, and then there's a cross shaft, which of course would go through the center there. Those springs go in these little spots there once it is inside of the carrier. And yeah, that's really all there is to the torque locker as far as parts go. So very little to go wrong here, and they have an excellent warranty to go with this. If you have to pop your carrier out, one thing that you need to make sure you do is when you take these bearing races off, if they're worn into the bearings that you're using, they need to stay with that bearing. You may not have to pull the carrier out if you have like stock 307 gears or something with a thinner ring gear. If you can get this pin out, you can do the torque locker without having to pull the ring gear and even pull the carrier. I'm going to remove the roll pin then that holds the cross shaft in place, and to do that I just ground off an Allen wrench that was a good size for this. With the cross shaft out, is rotate your spider gear assembly about 90 degrees and remove the spider gears. Torque recommends that you do here is to just take a really light coating of grease, put it on these teeth to kind of help just a little bit of stickiness to hold things together here. So a real light coating of this, and a multi-duty grease is what I'm using. That, and then on the surface where your thrust washers goes. And to make sure this is actual light coating, I'll wipe some of this excess off of here. Definitely want to make sure you look at both sides of the thrust washer here. So my carrier side looks actually really pretty good. There's a couple little shiny spots there, but nothing terrible. But then the back side here, there's kind of a big gouge. I don't see that in the spider gear. And then step one here is going to be popping these in. I'll take a second to point out here one of the design features of the torque locker that really makes it stand out from the competition. These bosses in pockets that I'm pointing to here. These are the key difference between a torque locker and the competition. So an Aussie locker or Spartan locker, they use dowels and springs, which make it more difficult to put together, but also that is their weakness. The way that Torque has designed this is a huge strength improvement over any other design. That's one of the reasons that I chose it. Just dropping that in there where it goes. And then of course, getting those to line up. There we go. I'm also just using a shim. This is a composite shim just because it's what I have laying around, but you could use cedar or any number of things that aren't going to mark this up. Notice that I've got some of the springs sticking out past the jaws there so that it does have some area to grip. And there it is. It's not all the way in yet. It does have like a little extra bit there that it needs to get past. Tap that all the way down. And it's there on the top. And until it's all the way in there, it could shoot out of there. So definitely want to be careful so you don't lose the spring, because these, they don't give you extra springs. And the springs hold a lot of energy. It would be really easy to just get ahead of yourself and do this backwards. So there's only one hole for the roll pin. Make sure that's in the side of your carrier that has the roll pin slot. At this point, we need to make sure that this gap is within spec. So you can either do that with a feeler gauge, or if you have a dial gauge caliper. And the spec is 0.145 inches and 0.175 inches. So I've just got a feeler gauge here. I've got a bunch of these all stacked together. Right now they're at 0.165. And that feels really good. So that's within spec. Let me just add to that. Let's see. If I add 0.15 to that, it would put me over spec. And that won't fit. So let's go see if I can find 0.1 and go right to spec. And that's really tight. Final step of bench installation here is 55 foot-pounds of torque. these get torqued to 50. So why torque locker? Why not one of the other brands out there? Aussie, Spartan, something like that. For me, it really comes down to made in the USA for one thing, and customer service and their warranty. When a company can put a warranty on it like they do, 4-year warranty, no horsepower limit, no tire size limit, you know that they're gonna stand behind their product the whole way through. The way I explained how it goes together without using dowels, that's really a big deal as far as strength goes. So that's how they're able to put such a great warranty on it. That and they do design, build, and test everything in the USA. Kind of my first impressions of the torque locker, it's almost invisible when driving, even with my hubs locked. For me, I wanted to try an automatic locker, hadn't used one before, and with having the triple stick transfer case and the locking hubs, I figured it's kind of the perfect scenario. If I didn't love it on the road with road manners of how a typical Dana 30 is, I figured that unlocking the hubs, it definitely becomes completely invisible on the street. But honestly, I mean, you can feel it when you're steering off-road, but if you're not on the throttle, it's not there, and I don't hear it clicking. It is a diesel. It's definitely, there's some other things, some other noises to hear, but it's I really don't notice the clicking sound. I don't feel a notchiness in the steering or anything like that. And the performance, I mean, it's on when you need it, and it's off when you don't. So I don't know what could be more perfect for a locker that you just don't even need to think about it. I have confidence that it's going to perform the way I want it to, because it already is performing exactly how I expected it to. It doesn't handle weird on the street. I can unlock the hubs if I need to, and normally I do. But also on the trail, I have the triple stick transfer case, so I can put it in 2-wheel drive or front or rear wheel drive very easily. Even the way I have the Jeep here, I've tried this before I put the locker in and could not get it up this far because the wheel that's drooping would just spin, and that's as far as I'd get. So my rear wheel was spinning when I did this, but the fronts just kept on gripping. Well, this Turd's all polished and installed in the Jeep, and I've been driving around on it for a couple days now. Other than the brakes, I really haven't done anything to it that's a real noticeable difference. But I do feel like I accomplished what I set out to do, in that it is the strongest I could make a Dana 30 housing without adding a truss. So I could still add alloy axle shaft or RCVs if I wanted to. There's some room for improvement in a few areas. I'm really interested to see how the axle shafts hold up with the locker and the strengthening caps that I put on the ears. Overall, how much stiffer it feels at speed off-road and some of those kind of things. If you want to see what I'm up to a little bit in more real time, you can follow me on Instagram at BleepinJeepJohn and see some of the things that I do to and with this Jeep. I'll catch you guys next time.